Daily Bible Time, Tuesday morning, 7 o'clock, and Dominic Steele here. And this week we are in the last verses of Matthew's Gospel from chapter 28. And we're getting context for the big picture command that Jesus gives in verse 18 of Matthew 28. Jesus came and said to them, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. And remember, I'm with you always to the end of the age." Now, a little background. And we started yesterday and we thought about Abraham. And God had promised to Abraham that all peoples on earth would be blessed, favoured through Abraham. Now, we read on and discovered that God's blessing to all the earth would come through the child, come through the descendant of Abraham. And so, excitingly, basically the first thing that is said about Jesus when he comes to earth is that he is the son of Abraham. Jesus is the one who's going to bring God's blessing to the nations, the son of Abraham. Now, you keep reading through the Old Testament and you get to the book of Daniel. And there's talk of God, the Ancient of Days, giving an amazing amount of authority to another figure in Daniel chapter 7, one called a Son of Man. And it's a prophecy that we discover later is a prophecy of Jesus. But here's what the prophecy says about this Son of Man. I'm in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 14. He was given authority to rule, glory, and a kingdom, so that people of every nation and language should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. When Jesus comes to earth, born in a stable, and then as an adult, around 30, begins his earthly ministry. Actually, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 12, Matthew 4, sentence 12, Jesus starts his earthly ministry in Galilee. And verse 12, when he'd heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. He left Nazareth behind, went to live in Capernaum by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, along the sea road, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Galilee is right there on the west edge of the Sea of Galilee, the tribal area of Naphtali and the tribal area of Zebulun. Why did Jesus start his ministry in Galilee? Well, I'll tell you, a few years ago, when we did a family drive around Australia, we discovered some pretty out there places. Some parts of Australia are upstream and influential, and some parts of Australia are downstream and uninfluential. In our trip around Australia, we actually went at one point to this little outback town in Western Australia called Fitzroy Crossing. And it's right up in the northwest of Western Australia. I was talking to a guy who'd lived there for 20 years, and he said, "You know, Dominic, everyone in Fitzroy Crossing is either wanted or unwanted." And I said, "Well, which one are you? Are you unwanted or unwanted?" And he said, "Well, I'm unwanted." Oh, this is a mucked up, desperate part of the world. That's the kind of place Galilee was. I'm thinking it's the first century equivalent of a third generation chronic unemployment, petrol sniffing area. It's a despised area. And Jesus first shed light, his light, in this despised area, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to the poor in spirit, Matthew chapter 6, verse 1. And then from Galilee, Jesus goes up to a mountain in Galilee in chapter 5. He gives the great sermon, the greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount. So much so that at the end of the sermon, they're speaking of Jesus and say, Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, when Jesus had finished this sermon, the crowds were astonished at his teaching because he was teaching them like one who had authority and not as their scribes. Jesus is the authoritative teacher, the one above all others, the one to be listened to and obeyed. Then through the account of Jesus' life written through Matthew, there's an incident after incident where Jesus displays extraordinary authority. I'll just give you two. Jesus in Matthew 9, sentence 6 of Matthew 9. But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. Then he told the paralytic, "Get up, pick up your mat and go home." And the man got up and went home. Jesus has the authority of God to forgive sins. Second one, Jesus has authority over unclean spirits and to heal. So Matthew chapter 10, sentence 1, let me give you that verse. Commissioning the 12. Jesus summons his 12 disciples. He gave them authority over unclean spirits, to drive them out, to heal every disease and sickness. So Jesus has the goods for authority. If he can speak better than the teachers of the law in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, if he can forgive sins, if he can drive out evil spirits, if he can heal every disease and sickness, then he's several points up on the Prime Minister of Australia and the President of America. But what sort of authority would Jesus wield? We're building up to all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. What would Jesus' style of leadership be? Matthew 20:25. Jesus called them and said, you know what the rulers of the Gentiles are like. They dominate them. The men of high position exercise power over them. It must not be like that with you. On the contrary, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. The way that Jesus exercises authority is in service. Jesus comes not to have a people fawning all over him. Jesus comes to die. And we've seen in his death, as we've looked at it these last few days, real authority from Jesus. The nervous Nellies gathered around, they attacked and criticised and mocked him, and yet in his demeanour, he was a rock of consistency. Jesus died as a king, and yet he was dead, and a dead man doesn't have that much authority. Jesus had talked of resurrection and of speaking to his followers in Galilee, the same place that he began his earthly ministry, with that address, Matthew chapter 5. Actually, in Matthew 26:31, Jesus said to them, tonight all of you will run away because of me, for it's written, I'll strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've been resurrected, I'll go ahead of you to Galilee. Now, during the crucifixion period, everyone around him was a gibbering mess, and Jesus was a model of rock-solid authority. He predicts what's going to happen. He says, today, people are going to kill me. Then I'm going to go to Fitzroy Crossing in northwestern Australia. I'm going to go to Galilee. Tomorrow, in the Daily Bible Time, we'll look at what Jesus said in those final sentences of Matthew's Gospel when he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go, therefore. That's tomorrow in Daily Bible Time. See you then.